Yes. So everyone, it is so great to have you back with us for the third annual Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars virtual teach-in. I'm excited about this session. Messages to and from the non-teaching parent is going to be led by Jason Esters. I'm so excited when we have representation from our dads. And I am just thrilled about Jason. Jason's been with us now. This is your second year, right? With us as a presenter. And just to tell you a little bit about Jason, he says that he fell in love with all the books on his parents' bookshelves, and his parents let him read any books he wanted, even the dangerous ones. I like dangerous books. Jason grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and attended Jackson State University, graduating with a degree in English and teacher education. He received his Ph.D. in English from Temple University, and he has been a community advocate for social justice and education reform in Philadelphia for well over a decade. He is now an assistant professor of English at the Community College of Philadelphia. And before CCP, he was the writing across the curriculum and writing in the disciplines coordinator at Lincoln University, where he helped faculty develop the appropriate tools for collecting data on student writing. As the former program director of the Crossbridge Scholars Program, Jason helped high school students break down institutional stereotypes and build extended community through writing. Jason is always reading and writing and is currently writing a book on substitute teaching as he continues to work with Philadelphia students in the school district of Philadelphia as a substitute teacher. Jason is currently the co-host of the Race and Faith Ciphers podcast and the Black Men Homeschool podcast. He lives in Lansdowne with his beautiful wife, Dion, and their 4 brilliant and rambunctious children. And I am so happy to have him here with us today. Take it away, Jason Esters. Yeah. All of you who are poets, let's do the snaps. And I'm going to fade into black. It's all on you, my brother.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that kind of introduction. It gets me hyped. So I want to welcome all of you all to my session. I want to thank all of you all for coming. I look forward to the teaching every year. And I'm going to share my screen with you all because I do have a presentation to actually give. Now, I got to be honest. A lot of times when we begin talking about homeschooling and what we're doing and all the wonderful things that come out of our homeschool experience, a lot of times we talk quite a bit about the good, and we should, because the good helps to motivate us to do better. But the reality is that this thing is hard. This thing is difficult. Teaching, homeschooling isn't easy. It's not easy. And to be perfectly honest, there are times during this homeschool journey that has threatened to even put my marriage in jeopardy. Some of the arguments, some of the discussions, some of the fights that we've had have just gone to the 10th degree. Now, a little bit about me. I am a professor of English. I do this podcast called the Black Men Homeschooling Podcast, and I'm a homeschooling dad, of course. And my homeschooling story is interesting because when me and my family first started homeschooling, I was the principal person at home. So for the first 2.5, 3 years, my wife would teach at a school. She taught at a private school. I would homeschool the kids during the day, and then I would work at night. I was able to teach night classes at night. So that's how it started, but that's not how it continued, because my wife eventually left her job, and then she eventually became the homeschooling parent, while I took on the additional job of subbing during the day and also teaching at night. So I was working 2 jobs. My wife was homeschooling, and then we also had a situation where we were caregiving at the same time for my father-in-law. So we had all kinds of things going on. And then COVID happened, and then we were stuck at home, and we were both teaching together. And sometimes it was great and sometimes it was friction. But now I am currently the non-teaching parent. My wife is at home and she's teaching the kids during the course of the day. She's teaching in a homeschool co-op. Sometimes I have an opportunity to teach in a homeschool co-op, but for the most part, I am the non-teaching parent. And one of the things that I recognize about being the non-teaching parent is that, sometimes my attention and my attitude towards what goes on at homeschooling, and when I was the one doing it. And that's one of the things that I want to talk to you all about today. Just the nature of the importance of communication while we're going through this homeschooling journey. There is nothing about this homeschool journey, to be perfectly honest, that I would change. I've enjoyed it. It's been rewarding. My family has benefited from it. But I would be remiss if I acted like it was all sunshine and roses during this journey. It has not been. In fact, some of the times, the hardest times that I've had in my adult life as a married husband and as a father have come in the context of homeschooling. And so the question that I want to ask today is, well, what do we need to do in order to negotiate that? So one of the things that I'd like for us to do is focus on some of the communication that sometimes we might have as homeschooling parents with our, what I'm calling our parenting partners. That might be your spouse, or if you're doing it alone, it might be your own parent, or maybe a grandparent, or maybe a family friend, or maybe somebody that you're in homeschool community with. You know, who else is your parenting partner on this journey? We weren't made to do this journey alone. We were made to do it with somebody. But in that somebodyness, there has to be clear communication, and there has to be connection, right? And so that's what I want to talk to you all about. So let's go ahead and get this thing started. The first thing that I'd like for you all to do is I'd like for you all to do a little activity for me. Take a moment and just write down something that you'd like to communicate to your parenting partner. You know, it might be a message, it could be any kind of message, you know, something that you really would like for your parenting partner to know. This might be your spouse, this might be, you know, your sibling, it might be whoever you do this homeschool thing with. What would you really like them to know? If you're watching this on a replay, you can actually pause the video and take time to actually write. But for us that are live, you might want to just hold a pen in this point for a moment, because it's really something important. I'm a writer, and I like teaching writing as well. And I had a mentor one time who told me this. My mentor told me that we don't always know what we think until we see what we say. And what that essentially means is that we think a lot of thoughts during the day, but the ones we capture and we put on paper really help to crystallize for us what we're actually thinking. And it can also help us to interpret a little bit better what we actually mean when we say the things that we say. One of the things that I've recognized in the conversations that I have in my own household and with people outside is that we do a lot of talking, but we don't always understand everything that's being said. I know another way of thinking about it is this. Sometimes we're not always clear in our intentions when we do speak. And because homeschooling is such a dynamic circumstance, there are real dividends that come from when we take time to really try to clarify what it is that we want to say. And so let's think a little bit about what it means to get communication from one parenting partner to the other. You know, what do we hear when our parenting partner says a particular thing? For the teaching parent, when the teaching parent communicates to the non-teaching parent, you know, what does that communication sound like? And vice versa, when the non-teaching parent talks to the teaching parent, what does that sound like? Let's explore. Let's think about it. All right. Sometimes, because of our issues with communication, sometimes when the non-teaching parent asks a question or brings something up, their lack of knowledge about what goes on in the homeschool sounds like doubt to the teaching parent. It might not necessarily be that the non-teaching parent doubts the teaching parent. It's just that they don't know enough to ask something more specific, right? Sometimes when the non-teaching parent says, man, you got this, go for it, you got it. Those pronouncements of ultimate faith, sometimes to the teaching parent, that sounds like disinterest, like they don't really want to be involved. You know, sometimes when the non-teaching parent raises legitimate concerns about, you know, what's going on, it sounds like criticism. And it doesn't always resonate as that foundational kind of feedback loop that we need when we're in community to edge ourselves to getting better, right? So my question to you all is, well, how do we address those issues that are real issues when it comes to relationships? We know that relationships aren't easy. We know that sometimes when we're in conversation, our feelings are right there at the forefront of how we hear, the back and forth. So what are some things that we can do to address that? So here's one thing that I'd like for us to do. Now, I got to tell you where this comes from. I mentioned that I do this podcast called Black Men Homeschool. And we did this podcast last year, this episode last year, where me and my podcast partner, Richard, we asked our wives to come on. And we just had a conversation about what support looks like in our homeschooling household. And in that conversation, I realized a couple of things. I realized, number one, the way me and my wife talk to each other is not the way Richard and his wife talk to each other. It's entirely different. It's entirely different. And that makes sense. But what I also recognize is that, there are some techniques that we can use in order to sharpen our conversation with one another. So here's my disclaimer before we get started. We know that the conversation between in relationships is going to sound different no matter what the relationship is, because of personality type, because of experiences, because of perspectives. That's true. But even so, even though we know that conversations sound different in every relationship, there are some techniques that we can use to help understand some of the dynamics of homeschooling relationships a bit better, right? So let's see if we can dive in. Here are a few messages that you might have heard from the non-teaching parent, okay? So I'm talking specifically to the teaching parent in the homeschool situation. Have you heard this from the non-teaching parent? What'd you do today? This is a pretty innocuous sounding question, but sometimes, every now and again, right, it may sound to one like someone said, hey, what did you do all day? It's not what they said, but sometimes that's what comes across. That's what it sounds like, right? And one of the issues with this is that homeschool parents don't get the respect that they get for the amount of work and the time and the job that they have to do. I mean, for those of us who taught in a public school context or in a brick and mortar school, you had to teach a full day, but you were able to go home afterwards. Homeschool parents don't get that, right? You would have professional development in order to prepare you for the type of teaching that you were doing. Most homeschool parents don't get that. That's why I'm thanking God for the teaching, because you get some of that community and that development. But most parents don't get that. And so it feels like a sting, right? But I also want to bring up something else. When you ask the question, the generalized question of, what you do today or what you do all day, that's just as, it's going to give you the same kind of answer that your kids will give you when you ask them, how was school today? The answer is going to be benign. It's going to be banal. It's going to be fine. You're not going to get any depth. So one suggestion, right, for the non-homeschooling parent is, if you're going to ask a question, let's make it more specific. The reality is, teaching parent, sometimes the non-teaching parent or partner doesn't have another go-to approach to initiate conversation about what's happening in homeschool. Well, why not? Because in American culture, we teach people to ask questions that we don't really want to know the answer to. We teach them to give them banal answers, right? So that's one of the truths of the way we're taught to engage and to initiate conversation. But the other truth that the non-teaching parent needs to understand is that, the non-teaching parent doesn't always see the constant judgment and criticism that the teaching parent may experience. I mean, if we're being honest, we know that there's a lot of judgment that happens when it comes to homeschool. Some of that judgment comes from the outside, people looking in and making their own opinions based on their biases. But again, halos off, some of that judgment comes from within the homeschool community too, right? And that always sits at the feet of the person who's teaching. To be perfectly honest, and this is from my experience being a man who's teaching his children and talking to other men who've taught their children, men definitely get less of that judgment than women do. especially when it comes to Black men and Black women. Black men, when they're seen doing anything for their kids, they hold us up in the air like we have a trophy in our hands. When people see Black women doing the exact same thing, the criticism is always much more harsh. Where's their trophy? Conversation for another day. But what are some ways that we can sharpen the conversations that we have? How do we move from general to more specific? Well, one thing that we can do is, instead of just saying, well, what did you do today? We can actually ask something more specific. Well, how did whatever the child's name is do with whatever the specific issue is today? How did Lily do with her spelling test? How did John do with his science today? That's exactly right. When we ask more specific questions, we get more specific answers. And it has a double benefit too, because it also encourages the reality that the level of investment between the parents is shared. I'm not just asking general questions. I'm invested in knowing what's happening specifically with the child or the children that are within our care. And that's vitally important, right? Keeping that connection sharp on the daily helps just to grease the wheels, to fine tune the motion of the homeschooling environment. And it helps keep the parents or the parent partners on one accord, right? And that really helps to even out those highs and lows that one experiences during school. All right, so what are some other things that we might hear? Sometimes the non-teaching parent or non-teaching partner will say something like, I don't want the kids to miss out on whatever it was. I don't want them to be weird, whatever it is. And when I put these comments in here, these aren't things that I made up. These are things that I've heard, right? And they always focus on, they skew negative in the speech pattern, right? But I want to suggest something. I want to suggest that even though the tone skews negative, the intention of the non-teaching partner isn't really to be negative, right? And I have to bring our podcast back into the conversation on this, because sometimes it's the non-teaching parent who wants the child to gain a specific set of skills or understanding or have a particular experience, but they're not really clear on how to orchestrate it, and they don't really know how to get to it. And so the language skews negative at first. Now, during our podcast, we did an episode at the beginning of last school year that said 10 things that you should know about homeschool. And we talked about how socialization is such a key component for many parents to ensure that their kids have it while they're engaged in the homeschool experience. And while there are some parents who will say, well, I don't want my kids to be homeschooled because I don't want them to be weird, right? And to be perfectly honest, that's a sticking point for me. I rail against that particular comment. So this is what I had to say about this during our podcast episode. And I wanted to play it here because I felt like it was useful. It might be useful to add into conversations that you all might have.
Right. They are. They're already different. They're already unique. They're already fearfully and wonderfully made. They already have their own purpose for what God's created for them in their lives. There's already this one thing in the world that they have been created to do, and only they can do it. And hopefully we can shepherd them into doing it. They're already weird. They're already different. It's okay. And guess what else? These times are weird. We got to figure out how we're going to build our children for the environment and for the time that they're in, right? So the real question isn't about, are they going to be weird? The real question is, are they getting what they need right where they are, right? And if not, we got people that are going to help them get what it is that they need. I know socialization is always a big concern. when it comes to homeschooling, right? But the real question is, what kind of socialization do you think they need? Right? What kind of socialization do you feel like they need? I mean, if we do like Brother Richard suggests, and we build a holistic child and we focus on their spiritual development and their physical development and their mental ability, their critical awareness, then we've already set them apart just there. Because those are aspects of one's character, that's aspects of one's growth that aren't always emphasized in our schools. So they're going to be different. The question is, are they in a place where they are developing the muscles that you feel like they need to have? And that's a hard question for all of us. We all have to ask that, and sometimes those answers change. But just because we pull our kids out of the place where we were socialized most doesn't mean that they're going to be operating at a social deficit. Might actually mean that they don't get some of the same scars we got.
So I wanted to play that for you all, just to bring up the point of the notion around adaptability. One of the wonderful things about homeschooling is that, in homeschool, we can adapt the school to fit what our kids need. Right? And sometimes those outside the homeschool community, or those, you might be in a relationship where somebody's like, I don't want my kids to be homeschooled. They don't really see the potential of the adaptability element, that their school, that learning environment can be shaped for that particular child. And so now I want to just speak to why they can't see it. They can't see it because the only way they know how to get the capacity that they have is through the scars that they gained. In a way, many times we all speak through our own trauma. But these kids is built different. They have different needs. Right? So the questions and the approach should really be around, well, are these kids getting, is my child getting what he or she needs in order to become the person that they need to be in the environment that they are in? More importantly, are they becoming the type of person that they are called to be in the purpose that they're called to serve? Right? That's the ultimate question. Not do they need to go through the same thing that I went through, but are they in a position to go through the thing they need to go through in order to get to where they want to go or where they need to go? I hope y'all are hearing me. All right. So what are some things that I can say in order to move the conversation towards that point? Well, one thing could be, okay, I hear you saying such, but what's going to be the best way for Samir to learn how to socialize, or to learn engineering, because that's what they're really into, or to learn how to fend for himself, or for Samira to learn financial literacy, or for Samira to learn Black history? What's going to be the best circumstance for them to learn it, right? That's one way to open the door for the kinds of conversations that don't lean towards our own understanding of where we came from, but where our children need to go. Are y'all with me? All right. Sounds good. All right. Sometimes that conversation can be prompted in order to ask for collaboration. Hey, I noticed that Larry is having some problems with reading. What do you think about us going to the library every week? What do you think about us joining a reading circle? What do you think about us doing a particular thing? Focusing around the problem. And this is something, an initiator of conversation that can work for the non-teaching parent or the teaching parent in order to get one accord over the educational goals. And I want to put a pin in this point also. Always remember that homeschooling doesn't look one way And usually when you choose a methodology for homeschooling, that methodology may change when your kid changes, right? So keeping the conversation around homeschooling dynamic is also really important. Hey, let's see if this works. And if it doesn't work, we can try something else. One argument that I've seen to be really effective in parenting partners who don't necessarily agree about the approach of school is when they both come to the agreement that, you know, brick and mortar school is not going anywhere. It's always there. If we need it, we can use it. But this opportunity to do this thing differently might be a little bit more fleeting. We may need to do this now. I've seen that to be a very powerful argument in people's relationships. Another thing about this kind of consideration that fits squarely on the child is also the reality that the parenting, there's nobody who cares more about the child than the people in that parenting partnership. Absolutely nobody. So if those people are in charge, then at the very least, that child is going to be loved through the process. And that's important, because oftentimes we'll sacrifice the love that our children deserve for the promise of them receiving an education that we're not even all that clear about. I'll save that conversation for another day. Sometimes a conversation needs a callback. You know what a callback is? When somebody raises up concern and then you don't talk about it for a while and then you come back to it. Not every conversation needs to happen all at once. And sometimes, because of the emotions involved, conversations need to have a bit of an ebb in order to begin flowing again. So this is a way that you can have a callback to a conversation. Yeah, hey, I remember that you want the kids to learn financial literacy. Well, what do you think about this particular strategy? Yeah. Having the callback is a way to table or postpone a conversation if you don't feel like it's a safe conversation or a generative conversation to have right there at the moment. It's a way to save that conversation for later. I have to let you know that's been one of the things to help preserve the kinds of communication, the positive kinds of communication in my own relationship. We can't have conversation for too long sometimes because the tempers flare up. Sometimes we got to take a chill pill. We got to take a break and then come back to it later. And that's a great way to restart the conversation. Now, sometimes, every so often, the message that you get from the non-teaching parent sounds a little bit like this. That's right. Crickets. You don't hear any conversation at all. And this kind of prompts one of the big arguments in my household sometimes. Okay. And now we're going to switch. We're going to start thinking about some of the messages that may have been delivered to the non-teaching parent. Right. So a lot of times, being the non-teaching parent, I won't initiate conversations around homeschool. And so my wife will come to me and say, when are we going to talk about homeschool? Right. When are we going to talk about this? When are we going to do some planning? And to be honest, even when I was doing the homeschooling parent, my idea of planning does not look like my wife's idea of planning. My idea of planning looks like wake up in the morning, stretch my arms, look up in the sky, look at the weather and say, oh, we're going to go here. Whereas my wife takes a more proactive approach, writes things down, puts it all in a binder, has a schedule for the month. You know, so planning looks different depending on our personality traits. But one of the things that's really important is for us to, really be thoughtful about when we discuss and process the homeschooling experience. That's important. We have to have that. And even though the non-teaching parent might not be involved on the front end with the planning, there needs to be some space for some of those discussions to happen, even when the non-teaching parent is unsure about homeschooling. And I know this is a pain piece for those of us who have people in our lives who might not be all on board with the homeschooling. We still need to be intentional about letting them know what's happening. And also timing is everything. For the non-teaching parent, and I would even say for the teaching parent, also active listening is a must. You know, active listening is when somebody else is talking, you're not talking, but you're processing what they're saying and looking for ways to respond in a positive manner. You know, that's really important. Just because the teaching parent, just because the non-teaching parent doesn't initiate conversations doesn't necessarily mean that they're not invested, that they're not interested. You know, when the non-teaching parent says, you know, how did blank go today? That might be the only way that individual may have to start getting some information and start feeling involved. And that's something else that's really important for us, I think. You know, one of the things that really been helpful for Dion and I, for my wife and I, when we've been thinking about homeschooling is, you know, when we're able to clarify roles and responsibilities, right? Like I mentioned to you all before that we've had times when I was the homeschooling parent. We've had times when she was the primary homeschool teacher. We've had times when both of us were working, when one of us was working. And so because we've had the relationship that was really fluid, sometimes we didn't always have clear roles and responsibilities. Now, I know that's not true for most people, but making sure it's clear how the non-teaching parent can support is really important. So I'm sure all of you all who are listening could probably add to this list, right? But what are some roles that the non-teaching parent can play? You know, one is being a prayer partner, you know, regardless of your faith, you know, lifting somebody up in both prayer consideration is really important. You know, so having that spiritual backing is important. We oftentimes think about how important it is for the non-teaching parent to be a financial provider, right? And being clear what being a financial provider for the homeschool actually means also. Is it just making sure you have a roof over your head, or is it also providing for curriculum, trips, co-ops, those kinds of things? Emotional support. And again, what emotional support looks like in the context of a relationship is different for everybody. But you know what it is when you're getting it. So being clear about who you are as a teaching parent and what you need for emotional support is important, and communicating that, you know, telling the non-teaching partner what it is that you need is also important. Being an assistant teacher at times could be a possibility. An administrator, one of the things that, you know, I am not the principal for our homeschool. That is entirely my wife, but I do the paperwork. Like I'll do the paperwork to submit to the district and those kinds of things. That's one of the roles that I have. You know, being the driver, being the trip coordinator, being the food prep cook, whatever the role is, if you're clear on the onset, it's really helpful. Because when you're not clear from the onset, you might be in danger of enabling a habitual line stepper. I remember that episode of Chappelle's Show when he talked about Rick James and you know, Charlie Murphy talked about Rick James and how Rick James was a habitual line stepper. That's one of the things that you don't want within the context of your homeschool. You don't want to be, as a non-teaching parent, you don't want to be stepping on the toes of the one that's actually teaching, right? And conversely, if the teaching parent actually has a role or responsibility and the non-teaching parent has a small role, then they need to keep their job. You know, don't step on the non-teaching parent's job because it minimizes their contribution. You know, if the rules are clear, then we can hold one another accountable. We know that homeschooling goes in lots of different directions. We know that stuff goes wrong and stuff changes, but if we keep our roles clear, then we can hold each other up and hold one another accountable. And, you know, I'm preaching to myself right now because I am often a habitual line stepper when my role is not clear. I wake up in the morning, I say, man, I'm gonna do this, 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 and this. And it drives my wife nuts because she says, wait, that was not the plan. Right. So I have a little bit of Rick James in me. Yes, I do. My goal is not to be a habitual line stepper. All right, so what are some other things that you might have heard from the teaching parent, right? Has a teaching parent ever said, if you are the teaching parent, have you ever said anything like, I feel like I'm doing this by myself, or, you know, I can't do this alone? And these are things that oftentimes the teaching parent might feel, but what they don't always consider is the fact that the non-teaching parent may be doing all that they can or all that they know how to do in the circumstances that they're in. And the non-teaching parent or partner might not know specifically what they need to do for the teaching parent to feel supported. You know, so they might be doing lots of things, but it might not necessarily be what the teaching parent needs in order to feel supported. And like I mentioned before, the non-teaching parent or partner might also feel like the contributions that they are making aren't being valued as much. Right? The reality is this, you shouldn't be doing this alone. You shouldn't be doing this alone. But one of the things that I've found is that sometimes when the teaching parent says, I feel like I'm doing this by myself, it's not because other things aren't being done, it's because they're not getting the kind of support that they need. And so being clear about what that support is and being clear about the roles is really important. Now, there are some circumstances when the teaching parent is actually doing it by themselves and they are overwhelmed. If you are an overwhelmed teaching parent, then let me tell you, I feel your pain and I need you to find community. I need you to find somebody that can share the burden with you because we weren't made to do this thing by ourselves and alone. And I recognize that it's easier said than done, but that's why places like the Teach-In exist, so that you don't have to be alone and you don't have to do it by yourself. If you are in relationship with someone and you're working on homeschool together in whatever capacity, I want you to know what support looks like. Support looks like trust. If you are the non-teaching parent, trust your loved one. Trust your loved one to do the very best for your children, right? Don't impede the process. Don't get in the way. Trust. On a personal note, one of the biggest arguments that I ever had with my wife around homeschooling was when she merely asked me, this is one of our transition times, she asked me, can I just have it by myself? Can I just homeschool them on my own? And I was like, why? Why you want to do it by yourself? I thought we was doing this thing together. I'm working on this. I'm working on this. How are you going to have the capacity to do it just by yourself? You're not by yourself, blah, 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 blah. And I regretted that ever since we had that conversation. You want to know why? Because what I should have just said was, I trust you. I'm going to support you in doing it. Let's make it happen. That's what I should have said. But I got in my feelings first before I got to that place. Support looks like trust. You guys can work things out. Just trust the person trying to do the difficult and hard thing. How do we spell love? Love is spelled T-I-M-E. These kids will come after you. Whoever your parenting partner is, take time apart from the children in order to just build into your own relationship, and also use some of that time to discuss where you want to take your children. You know, both trust and time are going to influence what we're able to accomplish when we're together. So that's always critical. All All right, as we begin to move towards the close of our time together, I just want to bring up a few things. So here are a few things that the teaching parent needs to hear from the non-teaching parent or partner. One of the things that they need to hear is they need to hear, I trust you. The teaching parent needs to hear, I trust you. The teaching parent needs to hear, how can I help? They need that opening in order to specifically say what it is that they need. And sometimes it takes time for them to figure out exactly what it is they need. The one that's teaching needs to sometimes hear, I love the way you do a particular thing. You're a good teacher. Sometimes we take the teaching parent for granted. We don't tell them they're good at doing this thing that nobody sees except for us. And that's really important. There are a few things that the non-teaching parent needs to hear from the teaching parent too. Right? And one thing is huge for me. Like, I feel like the non-teaching parent really needs to say, hey, thank you for being here to do such and such. I recognize that the teaching parent is doing the bulk of the teaching, but the non-teaching parent needs some recognition too. Those contributions that get overlooked build a sense of resentment, even if it's not spoken. And a little bit of gratitude goes a long way. And that's on both sides. Right? You'll be surprised when somebody unprompted says, hey, you're doing a great job. You'll be surprised about how far that goes. And again, that's not just for the non-teaching parent, that's for the teaching parent too. So I'm going to close by saying this. It doesn't really matter the context of education, doesn't really matter the context of the relationship. School is hard. Teaching is hard, learning is hard, relationships are hard, and we don't always get to choose the kind of hard that we go through. But it's okay. Want to know why? Because we can do hard things. We built for this. We really are. You can do hard things. We can do hard things, and we can do hard things together. Right? Last thing I want to say is, you're doing a good job. You're doing a great job. Keep moving. Let's be family. Let's keep building together. Let's not let the difficult times define us. Let's let how the adversity grows us into the people that we're trying to be. Let's let that define us. So I want to thank you all for giving me your attention. I want to thank you all for staying tuned. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to ask or share, and also use the website. We can share and build there as well.